Incident at Hawks Hill by Alan W. Eckert, Chapter 10. By the time the rain began on the second evening, Ben was inside the roomy den chamber and asleep. He had shaken the dirt out of his makeshift trouser bag and then put the pants back on for warmth. At the moment he lay curled on his side, and even though he had thrown some of the grasses over himself in an effort to keep warm, still he shivered in his sleep and occasionally moaned or cried out unintelligibly. Though the rain falling outside could not be heard, here and there droplets fell into the den area with monotonous persistence. Evening turned into night, and about an hour after full darkness had fallen, there was a wheezing in the main tunnel, and the female badger came cautiously into view. Had Ben been awake, he would have had difficulty seeing her in this darkness, but her own vision was such that she could see him reasonably well, and she stood quietly looking at his curled form for a considerable while. An almost inaudible whine came from her, and she shook herself vigorously twice, then came forward and touched the boy's arm with her nose. He did not wake. She whined faintly again, and squeezed into the narrow gap between the boy and the den wall. Ben felt her and opened his eyes, momentarily startled at her presence there. But her nearness and warmth were strangely comforting, and after a while he snuggled closer to her and put an arm over her. She tensed slightly, then relaxed and whined again. But there was no sound from Ben. He had already gone back to sleep. Shortly before dawn, the badger stirred and pulled out from under his arm. He did not awaken as she left the den, and he was still asleep when she returned. Though it had been daylight for more than an hour, she came close to him and made a guttural chattering sound, touched his cheek with her nose, and then stepped back a little when his eyes fluttered and opened. It was much lighter in the den chamber now. "I'm glad you came back, Badger," he said. He sat up and yawned, and then reached a hand out to pat her. This time she did not flinch at all, and after a moment she dipped her head and opened her mouth. A buff-colored egg rolled out. A few brown spots near the smaller end of the shell were darkened by her saliva. It was a little smaller than a hen's egg. For a moment, Ben couldn't believe it. There was the weird conviction in his mind during those first few seconds that she had actually laid the egg from her mouth. Hunger overcame amazement, and he picked up the egg greedily, recognizing it now as a prairie chicken egg. He wanted no drop of it to be wasted, so he picked up his rock chip from the den floor and gently tapped the speckled end of the egg until it buckled. It was just as well that he could not make out details too clearly in the dimness of this chamber, for the egg was about halfway along in its development to a chick, with a soft but decidedly recognizable embryo. He opened the shell enough so that the insides could come out, and then held the opening to his mouth and tilted his head back. The contents slid into his mouth, and almost before he realized it, he had swallowed. He blinked and then grinned. "Didn't even chew, Badger," he said. He stuck his tongue into the hole, but the inside was empty, and he tossed the eggshell to one side, and then watched with interest as the badger came close to him and sat down. He stroked her fur, and she moved even closer to him. She licked his cheek several times, and then, even as he continued to pat her, she lay down and rolled over onto her side, exposing her milk-swollen nipples to him. At first he didn't understand, but then it dawned on him that she wished to suckle him, as he had seen the ewes suckle their lambs. He wondered if he should, even thought for just an instant that he might try, but hungry though he was, the idea of it was just too much for him, and he shook his head. He patted her stomach, stroked the long fur some more, and gently rubbed the rounded ears, but he remained sitting upright. After a little while, she rolled back over and sat up. She grunted and chattered, a sound he mimicked immediately, and she picked up the empty eggshell in her mouth and disappeared down the main burrow with it. He hesitated, then followed her, but by the time he reached the surface, she was gone. The night's rain had cleansed and replenished the water supply in the depression of the rock. He drank deeply, and then he crawled over to the rock pile, moved around it halfway, and prepared to move his bowels. While perched on his heels, he gazed around and was alarmed to see not just one, but 3 horsemen in different directions, though none of them very near to him. He quickly finished, cleansed himself with a handful of grass, and rehitched his pants. In seconds he was back within the hole, and only his head and shoulders still remained sticking out, as he continued to observe. His alarm this time was not for himself, not with this haven of the den right beneath him, but instead for the badger, should she be seen by one of these men. Visions of the dead animal Burton had brought to Hawks Hill filled his mind, and he relived again the awful feel of the squashiness of the dead badger's skull under his touch, from the crushing blow Burton had struck it with his club. He was sick with the fear that the same would happen to his not-cheered companion. He needn't have worried. The female badger was no bumbling youngster. She was highly skilled in the ability to travel the prairie unseen if need be. The very squatness of her body kept her low to the ground, below the level of the grasses, if she so chose. Nevertheless, Ben was frightened, and when one of the riders turned in his direction, even though the better part of a mile away, he swiftly ducked back down the hole, and returned to the din chamber where he sat and trembled. About 20 minutes later, the female badger returned, bearing another prairie chicken egg. He took it off the den floor where she had placed it, and ate it just as he had eaten the first. His enjoyment of it was no less. She left him again, and half an hour later was back with a third egg. By midday she had brought a total of 8 eggs to him, and he had eaten them all in turn. Knowing that the prairie chicken normally had 12 to 14 eggs, he assumed that she had eaten some herself at the nest, and he wondered if it was the nest of the bird that he had eaten. The next time the badger returned to the den, she carried in her mouth not an egg, but a large prairie garter snake. This offering, too, she put on the den floor before him. But he would not take it, and when she realized this, she settled down and devoured it herself. Ben lay on his side watching her as she ate, but he had fallen asleep again before she was finished. She curled beside him as she had on the previous night, and almost automatically his arm came up to lie across her and keep her snugly against him. A pattern was being established between them, and both fell into it with remarkable ease. In the days which followed, she did most of her hunting by night, and when in the morning he would awaken, always there would be a new morsel on the floor for him. Once it was a chipmunk, and another time it was a molting adult Gadwall duck. Twice in a row she brought prairie chickens, and as he had done with the duck, he cut and chopped them apart with a sharp rock chip, giving her the head, intestines, and internal organs, wings, and feet, and himself eating the meat of the breast and legs. Several times she returned with mice, and had his hunger not been intense the first time, after a fast of 15 hours, he would have rejected the offering. But he put distaste aside and ripped away the skin, giving it and the head, feet, tail, and entrails back to her, then ate the meat himself. He found to his surprise and delight that it was not unpleasant at all, and so when she brought others back to the den, he cleaned and ate them without further hesitation. Twice she brought back large, dripping chunks of honeycomb in her mouth, and once even a fair-sized hunk of bread that someone had evidently dropped on the trail. Though the relationship between boy and badger had begun simply as one of food and shelter, it did not remain that way. A deep affection was developing between them, and a spirit of play as well. During the first week, Ben stayed underground almost all the time, coming to the surface only rarely to drink or relieve himself. The availability of drinking water for Ben always seemed to be a looming hazard, for the level in the rock depression lowered with each drink he took. Twice he had licked it dry, only to fortuitously have it refilled both times by another rainstorm. After the first week, Ben began to venture outside with her more often, always copying her movements, mimicking her grunts and wheezes, imitating her hissings and chatterings and snorts, even able to emulate with remarkable accuracy her waddling, flowing gait. Rarely did he stand erect, and then only to briefly look about himself for possible danger before dropping back to all fours. Frequently they played a sort of tag. She would run from him, and he would scramble after her through the tall grasses, panting and giggling at one point, wheezing and chattering at another. And when at last he would catch her, or she would let him catch her, he would tackle her around the middle, and they would roll over and over together, their snarlings and growlings of mock battle intermingling. Suddenly it would be his turn, and he would dash away with her closing in behind him, and she would pounce upon him in much the same manner, and once again they would wrestle amidst giggles and chatterings. It had been at the end of this third day with her that Ben noticed she seemed to be favoring her injured foot even more than previously. As she stretched out on the den floor, he sat beside her and gently raised her foot. She whined at first and made a slight effort to pull away, but he maintained a gentle grip and looked at the injury closely. The pad of the foot was very badly swollen and hot to the touch. A serous fluid was barely oozing from two small openings in the scabrous material covering the wound. He left her and went to the puddle, soaked one of his socks in it, and came back down to her. She had not moved, and except for a slightly heavy breathing, made no sound when he took her paw and dabbed it at length with the wet cloth. He was able to clean away the grit and dirt, but the crusty, scabrous material was stubborn. Abruptly he leaned over and spat on the wound, let the warm sputum stay there for a minute or two, and then daubed it with the cloth. A little bit of the scabbing came off, and he tried it again. Once more a small particle broke free, but the process was too slow for him. Just as she had frequently licked his face and hands, so now he leaned over and began licking her paw. Gradually the crusty surface softened and flaked off or melted away, and before long only the tender wound edge remained. Now he put her paw between the heels of his thumbs and applied a gentle but increasing pressure. She whined a bit, and he could feel her body trembling beside him, but she made no effort to pull away. And then, from first one and then the other of the two spots which had been oozing, there was a sudden little burst of dark reddish fluid, interspersed with little strands of gobs of pus. He wiped it away thoroughly with the damp sock and squeezed again, repeating the process 3 or 4 times until nothing more came from the cavity but a minute amount of clear fluid. There was no way whatever for him to bandage it, nor would she have been likely to leave a bandage in place had he been able to fashion one. Nevertheless, the wound improved. For 5 days running, he repeated the process of cleansing, licking, and squeezing, and at the end of that time a good healthy skin was forming. And to Ben's delight, he soon had good evidence that she was regaining the use of this foot in her hunting. The first evidence was on the morning of the 6th day, when she returned to the den with another chipmunk, and with the hairs between her toes of both front feet, clotted with mud from her digging. The second and more conclusive evidence came on the 12th night, when she returned with a fine large Franklin's ground squirrel, which she had quite evidently dug up from deep in its burrow. By the beginning of his 3rd week with her, Ben was astonishingly badger-like in all he did. He could keep up with her reasonably well, and he grunted and wheezed as he waddled along, just as she did. He was no longer so particular about what he would eat, and devoured with equal alacrity any prey she brought to him, including frogs and lemmings, and once even a small red-bellied snake. Nor was he content any more to remain in the den while she went off on her nightly hunting. He began following her, watching from the deep grasses as she sometimes caught prey on the surface, or coming close to her as she dug swiftly downward, though no longer as swiftly as she once could. After chipmunks and spermophiles and other ground squirrels, his night vision was becoming extremely good, and he almost seemed to prefer it to daylight. His mental clock became turned around, and like the female badger, he slept most of the day and was alert most of the night. Now and then, especially in the solitude of the den, when she was not with him, thoughts of his home and family would flood him, and he would break out in sobs, but such occasions became ever fewer as time progressed. There was no doubt that the big female badger had adopted him in place of her pups, which had died while she was trapped. It was evident that she was bringing food to him and attempting to train him in hunting, just as she would have done her own young. It was considerably more difficult, however, to understand the change in the boy, except in his habits of defecation and urination. Ben MacDonald had virtually ceased being a human being and was adapting incredibly well to his life of a badger. Water for Ben's consumption was no longer a real problem. 3/4 of a mile from their burrow was a small pothole with far more water than he could use, and they began going there regularly. Here also, sliding easily through the reedy shallows, he delighted in catching frogs, the one prey he had no difficulty with, and sharing them with her. But on their 5th journey together to the pothole, they encountered more than merely frogs. They left the den an hour after nightfall, but the grass tops were silvered by the glow of a full moon, and Ben could see well for a considerable distance. It was a pleasant, balmy night, and Ben was in a playful mood. He tugged several times at the badger's tail as she waddled along ahead of him toward the distant pothole. This was usually the way their romping and tussling began, but on this night she seemed preoccupied and ignored his little teasings, and Ben realized she sensed something that was bothering her. The panting wheeze that often accompanied her walking was absent, though occasionally she issued the faintest of grunts and growls, so softly voiced that Ben himself could barely hear them. From the way she was acting, Ben surmised that she herself did not know precisely what was wrong, for she paused frequently to raise her muzzle and sniff. Not until they were nearly to the pothole did her low growl rise in timbre, and her teeth gleam whitely in the moonlight, as her lip curled in a full snarl. At this time they had been just about to leave the area of deep grass to cross an encircling area of low green marshy ground around the pothole. Suddenly, emulating the female, Ben crouched and froze, still hidden in the final fringe of these deeper grasses. She was more exposed, and though he could not see what alarmed her, he could sense her trembling ahead of him, and he followed the direction of her gaze. Only when an echoing, deep-throated growl came from the reed fringe did he see the peril. There, crouching low and facing them, camouflaged by the pattern of shadows from the moonlit reeds falling over his back, was the big, yellow-gray mongrel, Lobo. He had obviously seen the badger, but apparently not the boy behind her. His fangs, much larger than the badger's, were exposed in a terrible snarl, and Ben felt a shudder ripple through him. He waited tensely, shivering, expecting Lobo to charge the badger. Instead, it was the badger who suddenly split the air with hair-raising, snarling growl that was almost a shriek, and hurled herself headlong at this foe. Lobo held his ground, and then at the last moment he met her charge with his own chilling variety of viciousness. They clinched, standing on their hind feet, grasping each other with forelegs and teeth, but it was the much greater weight of the dog which prevailed. His near 90 pounds of muscle thrust her over onto her back, and she went down shrieking and clawing and biting. For a while the struggle was so intense, so fast-moving, so shifting, that Ben could make no judgment about who was winning. There was a macabre, prehistoric unreality to the scene, which stirred him to his deepest fiber and caused the hair on his own nape to tighten and tingle. Abruptly, the badger broke free and spun around, raising her short tail as she did so, and secreting a strong musk in the direction of the dog. It was not as powerful a musk as that which the badger's weasel relative, the skunk, could eject, nor could she shoot it as accurately or as far as the skunk, but it was nonetheless a vile-smelling, oily liquid, and a terrible irritant to the eyes. Had it gotten into Lobo's eyes, it would have temporarily blinded him, and he would have been more vulnerable to her next attack. But none of the musk struck the dog, and now it was he who charged her. He came at her in an arching thrust, trying to catch her exposed flank. Driving in low, he missed her side, but somehow managed to get his snout beneath her and flip her. Until that moment, everywhere his teeth had closed on her, the grizzled fur was so dense and her skin so loose that she was able to pull away from him before he could cause any serious damage. But in being flipped this way, her throat was momentarily exposed. In that fragment of time, he had her. She gave a hideously strangled cry as the fangs locked in on her, and as he bore her to the ground on her back, the fearsome claws of both her front and hind feet tore frenziedly at his underside in an effort to disembowel. Long dark stains began streaking the big dog's belly and flanks, and his continuing growl had become as much from pain as from fury. But through it all he maintained his grip and exerted more and more pressure to drive his great canine teeth deeper into her. Suddenly there was another chattering growl as Ben streaked forward on all fours from his hiding place and threw himself on Lobo's rear. With one hand he gripped the dog's tail, and with the other hind leg. It may have been accidental, or it may have been the result of a primitive instinct from deep in some remote primeval corner of his brain, directing it. But whichever was the case, he drove his open, snarling mouth down into the Achilles tendon of the dog he was holding, feeling the toughness of that thick sinew between his teeth, and exerting every ounce of pressure his jaws could muster in the bite. The surprise, the agonizing pain, and the hazard of his rear attack caused Lobo to relinquish his hold on the badger and wheel to face his new adversary. But the dog was badly off balance now, and the ravaging teeth which snapped together at the boy missed his flesh and caught only the shoulder of his sleeve and ripped it down its length. Ben did not relinquish his hold, and in Lobo's new concentration on him, the dog forgot, for a fatal instant, the big female badger. She had regained her feet, and now she catapulted into him, and this time it was her teeth which found the mark. They closed low on Lobo's throat, and instantly she braced all 4 feet against him, and tore wrenchingly, the thrust of her feet adding even greater tearing strength to her jaws. The growling from Lobo changed abruptly to a terrified shriek, and his legs scrabbled as he tried desperately to wrest himself away. It was too late. The incredible strength of the badger, the fierceness with which she bit and pushed simultaneously, was too much. The skin of Lobo's throat tore, and the great jugular held for just an instant longer, and then it too tore open. Immediately all three combatants were bathed in a gush of blood, and the grass and ground became slippery with it. Lobo's strength rapidly dwindled, but not until the dog lay limp in her teeth did the badger release her grip on his throat. Ben had already let go and was half sprawled on the spongy ground, stunned by all that had happened and trembling violently. The badger whined softly and came to him, nuzzling him and licking his face. He put his arms around her and leaned his head against hers, and suddenly he was crying. When she pulled out of his grasp and went back to the dead dog, again growling ominously, he followed her and growled as she did. But when she made as if to leave, he hesitated. If the dog should be found here, George Burton was sure to come with traps or guns to destroy whatever killed Lobo. And so, despite the badger's insistent chattering at him, he gripped the dog by the hind legs, and on his knees backed into the densest portion of the cattail reeds, pulling Lobo after him. He was in the water to his waist when he finally let go of the dead animal. Its head and hindquarters were under water, but its left side, buoyed with the air locked in its body, was still afloat. Twice Ben thumped the exposed side of the carcass with his small fist, and a small amount of air was forced out. While the remains no longer floated so high, still they floated. He didn't know what else to do, so he merely bent a number of the surrounding reeds over until they draped across the dog's body, and fairly well masked it. Then he backed out onto the marshy ground again, pushing upright the reeds he had disturbed, and when he was finished, it would have been difficult to detect that anyone had gone in there. They went back to the burrow then, the badger and the boy. In its shelter, as another thunderstorm boomed outside, the boy found the several places where Lobo's teeth had punctured her skin, and he licked them clean for her. Ben himself had suffered no injury. They had nothing to eat that night or the next day, but on the following evening they were out hunting together again, and by morning they had shared in eating 4 jumping mice, a lemming, a leopard frog, and a fledgling pintail duck. As the days and nights continued, however, subtle but fundamental change was taking place in Ben. Though the female badger seemed to thrive on their relationship, Ben's physical condition had begun deteriorating. He had come to the burrow during the last week of June. By the middle of July, he had become well ensconced in his new wild existence, and as the August moon waxed and then began to wane, his metamorphosis was almost complete. But as mid-August passed and the days of that month dwindled, he became increasingly lethargic. Only infrequently would he play and wrestle with the big female badger, and he no longer cared to travel long distances with her to hunt. When, after hunting alone one night, she returned to the den before dawn with a large, fat prairie dog, her first such prey since before her tragedy, he was content to remain in the den until it was all gone, alternately feeding on it and sleeping, and going no farther from the den than the pothole, in order to drink when the supply in the basin-shaped rock became depleted. Thin and slight he might have been before, but now he was becoming practically skeletal. His eyes had acquired an unhealthy brightness, and often he moaned in his sleep. It was clear that he was becoming quite unwell, unless something occurred to change matters, and very soon at that. Benjamin MacDonald was apt to become just as dead as the majority of people in this area of the Manitoba prairie country thought him to be.